Okay, today's daf is Kuf Yud Zayin, but we're going to start on Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Bet at the Mishnah, and hopefully we'll be able to get through in time. We should be able to do it. So the Mishnah says, Matzilin tika sefer masefer v'tika tefilin tefilin ve'af al pi sheyesh betochan ma'ot. So this is again talking about this issue of on Shabbat, if God forbid there's a fire, the Chachamim limited the amount of things that you can save and salvage from the house because they're worried that a person in a state of panic will end up extinguishing the fire or performing some other malacha that they shouldn't in the process of trying to save their belongings. So we said one of the things that we can save is Kol Kitvei HaKodesh. That's the name of the perek. That's why it's called Kol Kitvei HaKodesh, because it says you can save all of the Sfarim, all of the holy Sfarim. So it says you can save the Tika Sefer with the Sefer. It's not only the scroll itself that you can save, but you can save the container or the covering of the scroll, the case of the scroll as well. And you can save the case or the bag of the tefillin with the tefillin, even if there's money inside the case. In other words, even if there are extraneous things like money that might be muktzeh, you're not really supposed to handle money, you're not really supposed to handle such items on Shabbat, but since you are taking this bag out, and this bag has your tefillin inside, even though it has other muktzeh things inside as well, it doesn't matter. Where can you take the Sifrei Torah? You're saving Sifrei Torah, you're saving the bag or the case of the Sefer Torah, you're saving other things inside. Where can you take it? So, lamavoy she'eno mefulash, according to the rabbis, you can take it to a mavoy she'eno mefulash, which means to say that you can take it to a place which is closed. Mefulash means a place which is open, and normally you wouldn't be able to carry in it on Shabbat. Rabbinically, okay? So the Chachamim are saying you can carry it into a place that's right, it would be like that, which is rabbinically prohibited. It's going to explain more what kind of mavoi we're talking about, but usually this was like an alley in between two courtyards. So if you imagine two courtyards, in between the courtyards was this mavoi. The mavoi would be sort of the exit from the courtyard. So if you came out of your house was in sort of a development with different homes, and a court which was called a chatzer, and it spilled out into this mavoi. The mavoi was shared by numerous chatzerot. Okay, so it was and then this mavoi would lead out into the public domain. That was how people would get from their chatzer. They would come out of their house, walk through their chatzer, come to their mavoi, and from the mavoi go to the public domain. So there were different kinds of mavuot, and one of them being mifulash means that it's completely open. Normally what that means is that it means on the ends. So normally that means that it's just two walls with an open on both ends sort of structure. So there are only two walls, not three. Okay? Usually we think of she'eno mefulash as a closed one, which means that the third wall is closed and there's only one wall open at the end. So but either way, we're going to see the Gemara is going to deal with that problem. So the Chachamim say that you can only carry these items into a mavoi she'eno mefulash, into an area which is not mefulash, meaning an area that is not wide open. Whereas, according to Ben Betera says, after the mefulash, even a place that is wide open, where you normally wouldn't be able to carry things on on Shabbat, you're allowed to carry it. So the Gemara says as follows. And now what the Gemara is going to get into is an issue which is tangential to our Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. What this means is that let's say Pesach falls out on Sunday. So if Pesach falls out on Sunday, that means that they would offer the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, because that means that the Seder is Saturday night. Now, if they offer the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, they're not actually going to partake of the Korban Pesach on Shabbat, because the Pesach sacrifice has to be eaten the night after it's offered. It's offered on the Erev of the holiday, the eve of the holiday. So if the eve of Passover is a Shabbat, you offer the Korban Pesach, but you don't you don't partake of the Korban Pesach until the night. So the question is, to what extent can you do the necessary melachot that go into preparing the Korban Pesach and offering it on that Shabbat? So Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says, all you can do is skin the animal, up to the chest of the animal. Why? Because all you need to do is extract the emurin. You need to extract the innards of the animal. We're right on the Mishnah here. We're right here.
At the bottom.
Where we left yesterday. On Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Bet. Yeah.
Tet Zayin?
Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Bet.
Oh, Masekhet.
Yeah. Yeah. You can skin it up to the chest. Why? Why can't you skin the rest? Because you skin the rest in order to eat the meat. But you're not going to roast or eat the meat until that night, until after Shabbat. On Shabbat itself, all you need to do is offer the innards of the animal. And all you need to do to offer the innards of the animal is skin it up to the chest. You don't need to go beyond that. So what Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka is saying is, only skin it up to the point that's absolutely necessary to accomplish your goal. Don't go any further than that. And the Chachamim say, do the entire thing. So even though, in essence, you're doing something that isn't necessary right now, because really you could wait to skin it until after Shabbat. There's no need to skin it now on Shabbat because you're not going to be eating the meat on Shabbat anyway. You can do the entire thing. So Bishlam, Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka daha it avid le'tzorch gavoa. Now we understand Rabbi Yochanan the position of Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, because the point is you did all you needed to do for tzorech gavoa, because what needs to be done on that Shabbat is that the innards of the Korban Pesach and the blood have to be applied to the altar. Nothing has to be done with the meat, because that was the way it went. Let's say on a regular week, let's say the Seder is Tuesday night. Let's say Tuesday night is the Seder. So Tuesday day, they would sacrifice the Korban Pesach, put the innards on the Mizbeach, put the blood, and then they would roast it, and that night you would eat it. So since it's Shabbat, we're not going to roast it on that day because you're not going to eat it until the night anyway.
What would they do with the animal then?
They just have to leave it.
They just leave it like that.
Yeah. So Rabbi Yishmael is saying only skin it to the point that you need for that day, and then at the nighttime when you need the meat to roast it, you can do the rest. Okay. Yeah, but according to the rabbis, what is the reason why we permit you to skin the entire thing? You don't need to on Shabbat. You don't need it till Saturday night. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Bar Chana said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the Amar Kara, because the pasuk says, "Kol po'al Hashem lema'aneu." Everything Hashem does is for His sake. In other words, why are we doing it? We're doing it for the kivod shamayim. We're doing it for the honor of Hashem. So v'hacha mai lema'aneu ika. What is the kivod shamayim? What is the honor of heaven here? Rav Yosef Amar Shlo Yasriach. Rav Yosef says, because if you leave the meat with the skin only partially flayed and not completely removed, what's going to happen? It's going to spoil. It's going to be disgusting. Rava says, Rava says it's not because the meat is going to spoil per se, but because it looks like this thing is a nevela. It looks like this thing is trash because you didn't skin the whole thing. You only skinned part of it, and you left it like that on the floor. So it doesn't look right. So my benayu, what's the difference between the mika benayu demenacha petorah didava? There's a difference. Inami yoma de istana. There are two cases where there would be a difference between these two reasons, because Rav Yosef is saying it's a matter of the meat going bad. Rava is saying it's a matter of appearances, that it looks like disrespectful. So according to Rava, what if you placed it on a table of gold? Okay, so that would remove the problem. According to Rav Yosef, if it was a very cool day, it wouldn't be a problem because the meat wouldn't be spoiled. So there's a difference depending on how you interpret it, where the rule would be applicable. Okay? In other words, according to Rav Yosef, maybe on a cool day you wouldn't need to flay the entire thing. According to Rava, if you had a golden table to put it on, maybe you wouldn't need to flay the entire thing. But in normal circumstances, you would need to because of disrespect. Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka Hai Po'al Hashem Lemanei Umay Avid Lei. What does Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, say about the concern of honoring Hashem? Shelo Yotzei Te'emurin Kodem Hafshatat Ha'or. Because he says, okay, you know what? I'll grant you this. That you could have argued not to flay the skin at all, just to cut it open and pull the innards out. But I'm not going to require you to pull the innards out without flaying it at all. In other words, if you really want to minimize the transgression on Shabbat, I could require you just to make a surgical incision and take the emurin out without flaying off any of the skin. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to say that you can at least flay the part of the skin that you need to remove the innards. My Tama, what's the reason? Amar Rav Huna bare de Rav Natan. Rav Huna says, the son of Rav Natan says, Mishum nimin. Because if you don't flay the skin at all, you know what's going to happen? Hairs and fibers from the hair of the animal are going to get onto the meat. Are going to get onto the emurin that when you remove them. Okay? So we don't want that to happen, because then you're going to have hair on the mizbeach. It's going to burn on there. It's going to be a bad smell. We don't want that. So we tell you can flay at least the part that you need to remove the emurin. So both of them agree that you're going a little bit beyond what's absolutely necessary to take the innards out of the korban. Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokai is saying only the minimum amount necessary to remove the emurin, so that you don't get hairs on it. And the rabbis are saying, you know what? Don't leave it laying out like a nevela. Don't leave it laying out like a carcass, or don't let it spoil. And because of that, you're allowed to skin the entire thing. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Mar Ukva. Rav Chisda said that Mar Ukva said, what did the rabbis respond to Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokah's argument? They said, and here's where our Mishnah comes in, because you might say, now, what does this have to do with saving Sifrei Torah on Shabbat? The answer is that the rabbi said to him, Im matzilin tik hasefer ima sefer. Okay, haki kamrele. This is what they said. Im matzilin tik hasefer ima sefer lo nafshit the pesach me'oro. If you're allowed to remove the case of the Sefer Torah together with the Sefer Torah, can't we remove the skin from the Korban Pesach? Okay, so the Gemara says, what kind of an argument is that? Midame. Hatam tiltul hachamelacha. What is the comparison? One is talking about moving something from one place to another. Moving the Sefer Torah together with the case. Here you're talking about doing a melacha of skinning the animal. So true, you're talking about doing something unnecessary. In other words, so take that. What is the analogy? The analogy is, well, really all you need to move is the Sefer Torah, so maybe you should leave the case behind. So too, maybe you only really need to skin the animal a certain amount, but you're doing more. Right? So the rabbis are saying, just like when you remove the Sefer Torah, you don't just do the minimum that you need, but you can even take the case. So too here, when you skin the animal, don't just do the minimum that you need, skin the whole thing. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? One is talking about moving an item, and that's only a rabbinical prohibition to begin with, to remove the item. Here you're talking about a biblical prohibition of skinning the animal on Shabbat. How can you compare the two? Rather, what does the Gemara say? Amar Ravashi. Ravashi says, they really had two arguments here. There were really two arguments. One was about the melacha, and one was about moving the item. So, and this is what they said to him. That if you're going to move, so forget about the melacha. The argument about melacha wasn't what they brought the Mishnah to prove. They brought the Mishnah to prove something about the issue of moving it. Okay, so what was the moving it? That Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Barokah said you cannot move the Korban Pesach on Shabbat. In other words, you slaughter it, you have to leave it there. It's muktzeh. Okay, so Rashi explains that why do you want to move the meat? You want to move the meat because it's an honor to the meat that it be moved out of a place where it's laying on Shabbat, and therefore, so what's the problem? The skin is muktzeh, because what function does the skin have? None. The basar is really like the Sefer Torah, because the basar is the holy thing that's going to be eaten at night. So you should be able to move it. So even though the skin is muktzeh, you should be able to move it because of the basar, because of the meat. And Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Barokah held that you can't move it. So the Chachamim said, but look, you see that you can move the Sefer Torah with the covering, even though the covering doesn't need to be moved. So why can't you move the basar, even though you're moving the skin? True, the skin doesn't need to be moved, but the basar needs to be moved. So we move to Kuf Yudzayin Amud Aleph. Midame, what is the comparison here? Hatam nasan masis ledavar mutar, hachanase masis ledavar asur. So Rashi explains here that there is a fundamental shift in the premise of the Gemara. What is the fundamental shift in the premise of the Gemara? Now the Gemara is saying, wait a second. Tika sefer, this is what Rashi says. Tika sefer nasa basis ledavar mutar letaltelo b'lom shum deleka. That really, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the moving the sefer, the container, okay, the sefer with the cover that also has money inside, right? So that is something that is a basis ledavar mutar. Okay, but it's a basis, it's a support for the permitted thing. Okay, in other words, you have the Sefer Torah, it's permitted, but in our case, it's a basis of davar ha'asur, because really now the Gemara is changing and saying that the meat is also muktzeh. In other words, when it comes to the Sefer Torah, you're not doing a prohibition of muktzeh. The Sefer Torah is allowed to be moved. A Sefer Torah we move all the time. The cover is allowed to be moved. Okay, even if it has money inside, it doesn't matter. The main thing you're moving is the Sefer Torah and the tik. There's no problem moving that. But here, the meat and the skin, the Gemara is saying now, both should really be muktzeh. You can't say I'm moving the skin because of the meat, because even the meat is a problem. Why? Because the meat can't be eaten until the nighttime. It should really be muktzeh too. That's how Rashi interprets it. So now, this is what they said to him. But what about the fact that there's money inside? Okay, so again, the Gemara answers. So again, the same thing. In other words, in the first case, it said, well, the Sefer Torah is permitted to be moved anyway. So how can you compare that to the meat and the skin, where the meat and the skin are not permitted to be moved? So now the Gemara says, well, what about the case where there's money inside the tik? Even when there's money inside the tik, you can move it. But still, why are you moving it? Because there's at least something there that's permitted to be moved, the Sefer Torah. So I don't care that there's also something forbidden to be moved. But in the case where with the meat and the skin, they're both prohibited. So I have no justification. Rather, this is what they meant. So maybe we could say like this. Now, what was the analogy that the rabbis made? Not anything to do with carrying the Sefer Torah. What they said was, if I needed to remove a Sefer Torah from the house, and the only box that I had to remove it had money in it, can't I pick up the box, bring it over and put the Sefer Torah inside? Let's say it's scrolls. Let's say you're a sofer. You have scrolls with no case. Okay, so can't I grab a box that has money inside and use it in order to transport the Sefer Torah? Even though when I'm carrying that box with money in it, it is purely muktzeh. But I'm violating muktzeh. Why? Because I want to be able to save the Sefer Torah. I want to be able to save the scrolls. So too, I should be able to move the meat and the skin, even though both are muktzeh. Why should I be able to move them? Because I'm doing it for the mitzvah. I don't want it to be ruined. I'm doing it l'chvod shamayim. I'm doing it for the sake of heaven. So v'hi gufa minalan. That itself, how do you know that you're allowed to do it? Are you assuming that you can actually pick up a box with money in it and use it in the first place to carry the Sefer Torah? It doesn't say that. It says if the box that the Sefer Torah is already in has money in it, you're allowed to move it. It doesn't say you can bring a box that has money in it and use that. It never said that.
If it's there already.
If it's there already. So midame hatam adachi vachi nafla deleka hacha adachi vachi lishadinan. Because there's no comparison. If you're picking up a box with money in it to come get the Sefer Torah, then throw the money out of the box on the way. You could kill achar yad. You could indirectly tilt the box, let the money fall out of it, and then put the Sefer Torah inside. You don't need to carry the money. But in a case where the scroll was already in a box that had money, maybe you don't have time to figure out a way to remove the money from the box, so the rabbis allowed you to carry out the box because the fire was coming. But in this case, you're picking up the box and carrying it over to the Sefer Torah anyway. On your way, why don't you just let the money drop out then? So we don't see any proof that you could actually pick up a purely muktzeh thing to save something else. And so too, we don't see any proof that you could pick up a purely muktzeh thing of the meat and the skin in order to save it for the mitzvah. We don't see any proof that should be the case. At least no proof from our Mishnah that should be the case. And therefore we don't see any reason why the rabbis would cite that Mishnah in an argument with Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. Ella Amar Mar Bar Ravashi. Rather, the Mar Bar Ravashi came back to the original premise. Le'olam ki damrinan mikara. We aren't talking here about muktzeh. We're not talking about moving the meat or moving the skin. That wasn't the issue. Let's go back to what we originally knew the issue was. What did we originally know that the issue was? That it had to do with skinning the animal, right? And what was the argument? That Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka said that you can skin the animal only up to hechazeh, only up to the chest, so that you remove what you need to remove. And the Chachamim said you could remove the whole thing. Okay? And ve'udeka kashyalach Hacha tiltul v'hacha melacha. And what you said there was, how can they bring any kind of a proof from our Mishnah? Our Mishnah is dealing with tiltul, merely moving something. Whereas they are arguing about the melacha, they are arguing about an actual biblical violation of skinning. So how can you compare the two? And one of them should be hatam, not hacha. Of course, it should be hatam. Hatam tiltul v'hacha melacha. So kigon dilo kaba'ele la'or. That the answer is, we are going to downgrade the skinning. We're downgrading the skinning. You're assuming that they're arguing about a biblical violation of skinning. And therefore you said, how can you compare carrying something which is only rabbinically prohibited with skinning something which is biblically prohibited? The answer is no. We're talking about rabbinic skinning. How is that? Because because you don't need the skin. You're going to trash the skin. But didn't we say that even according to Rabbi Shimon, who is lenient in a davar she'eino mitkaven, where you don't intend, and here you don't intend to take the skin, you only intend to remove it so that you can extract the emurin, doesn't he agree that it's still prohibited? So the answer is no. That the shakele bebarzeh, because you are cutting it into tiny pieces as you go along. And since you're cutting it into tiny pieces as you go along, therefore, you're allowed to, it's only rabbinically prohibited to flay skin in that way. And so therefore what the rabbis said to Rabbi Yishmael ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka was, they made an analogy and they said, listen, over here it's only a rabbinical prohibition to remove the skin. And why are we removing it? We're removing it for the sake of l'chvod shamayim. So just like with the Sefer Torah, you're allowed to remove it, and you're allowed to remove it even beyond what's necessary, even removing the tik. Why? Because even though you're normally not allowed to remove any possessions more than necessary, you're allowed to violate the rabbinic prohibition for the sake of kivod shamayim, for the sake of the Sefer Torah. So to here, you're allowed to violate a rabbinic prohibition of flaying on the whole animal, even beyond what you need to, even beyond what's absolutely necessary, since it is kol po'al Hashem lema'anehu, because it's done for the sake of heaven, and therefore we can learn that when you're violating a rabbinic prohibition, in other words, like in the case of carrying out the Sefer Torah, you can go beyond what's absolutely necessary once you have permission to do it for the sake of heaven. So to here, once you're flaying the animal, you can go beyond what's absolutely necessary to flay.
That at the beginning they just didn't agree.
They didn't realize that it was rabbinically. It was rabbinic.
And they said no, it's not. It's not.
So they were trying to find something rabbinic. They were trying to find muktzeh. So the issue here is the only huge problem with this Gemara that many of the Mefarshim raise is this is not the davar she'eino mitkaven. The Gemara is either imprecise in its language, or we have there are different approaches taken here, all of which are complicated. But basically, the difficulty is that davar she'eino mitkaven, this is not an example of it. Davar she'eino mitkaven is when you're doing something that, and there's an unintended result. Here you intend to skin the animal. This is actually what we would call melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, where you do something where you don't want the result, because you're just cutting it into small pieces, because you don't really want the skin. You just want to get the skin out of the way to remove the emurin. So really, the easiest way to understand this Gemara is that it's speaking in not necessarily the most precise terminology, and what it means is melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, which would be the same thing, basically that it is it's only rabbinically prohibited in this case. So now we move to the next issue, leichan matzilin otan. Where can you move the Sefer Torah? What kind of area can you move it into? And we said that the Chachamim said you can only move it into a mavoi she'eino mefulash, only into a mavoi which is not fully open. In other words, it has to be an enclosed area which would not be rabbinically prohibited to carry. And Ben Betera said you can move it into a place where it is rabbinically prohibited to carry. Okay, so hechidame mifulash, hechidame she'eino mifulash. What kind of a place are we talking about here? So Amar Rav Chizda said, Shalosh mechitzot u'shnei lechayin zeu mavoi she'eino mifulash. Gimel mechitzot v'lechai echad zeu mavoi mifulash v'tarvayu alibad Rabbi Eliezer. What it means is like this, that we talked about before, how you had this sort of alleyway between chatzerot. It could either be open on two ends or closed on one of the ends. We're talking about one that is closed on one of the ends. So actually it has three walls. The two sides are closed and the back wall is closed. It's like a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac or a dead end a dead-end mavoi, and it either has one lechi or two lechayim. Now, what does this mean? When you have one lechi, what it means is a board on one side. What was the reason why they would put a vertical board on one side? What? Yeah. Lechi is to show you that you're going from a place where it's permitted to carry to a place where it's not permitted to carry. Because once you walk out of that mavoi, you're in the public domain. So it was a mark to show you. Now, you can have one that has two lechayim, two things on either side, okay, which would be like, in other words, one on the right, one on the left. Or you can have one that says two lechayim, you can have just one lechi. Okay? And so what he's saying is that the rabbis permit you to carry it only into a place that has two lechayim. Okay? And the Chachamim and Ben Betera is allowing you to carry it even into a place that has only one lechi. And everybody's following Rabbi Eliezer. What does this mean? It's not as we learned in the Mishnah Eruvin, that hechsher mavoi. How do you make a mavoi permitted to carry? Shammai omrim lechi v'korah. You need a vertical board and a horizontal board over the top of the end of the mavoi. You need one or the other on the end. Rabbi Eliezer omer shenei lechayim. You need two lechayim. Okay, so that and the question. So one lechi would be called it would still be rabbinically prohibited to carry. You need two. Zeo mavoi she'eino mifulash. So it's according to the. I'm sorry, I skipped the part. So Amar le Rabba says, what do you mean? You're telling me that an enclosed mavoi where there are three walls basically and it's only open on one end, that's called open? And according to the rabbis, not only should you be able to carry into this mavoi a Sefer Torah, you should be able to carry anything into this mavoi. Why? Because there's no bending of the rules here. A mavoi that has three walls and a lechi on one side, according to Beit Hillel, that's perfectly fine. That's a perfectly kasher mavoi. So what is the chidush in the Mishnah then? The chidush in the Mishnah is supposed to be showing you that there's something about this mavoi which is special, that we're bending the rules a little bit, okay? So according to the rabbis, you can take it into a place that's eno mifulash, right? That's not mifulash. And according to Ben Betera, even if it is mifulash, but according to this, it should be totally permitted. The definition of eno mifulash, of not open, is totally permitted. So what is the chidush here? Ela Amar Rabba says shetei machito d'shnei lechayin zeu mavoi she'eino mifulash. Shtei machito d'lechayachad zeu mavoi mifulash. That, what are we talking about here? Not a mavoi that has three walls and it's enclosed, but we're talking about a mavoi that has only two walls, one on either side, and it's open on both ends. And what do you have? Either a lechi, okay, when it has a two lechayin, that is called Eino Mifulash, because it has two lechayin fixing it on one of the ends. And where it is one lechi, that's called Mifulash. So Ben Betera would allow you to bring the Sefer Torah even into one that had one lechi. And the Chachamim would allow you to bring it in only if it had two lechayim. And they're following the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda the Tanya, as it says in the Baraita, Yater al ken amar Rabbi Yehuda mi sheyesh lo shnei batim v'shnei tzidei reshut harabim ose lechi mikan v'lechi mikan o kora mikan v'kora mikan v'noseh v'noten be'emtza. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, somebody who has two houses and in the middle is a Reshut Harabim, what can he do? Put a lechi on one side, a lechi on the other side, even though there's a Reshut Harabim coming through, or a board going across on one side, right, from one side to the other. That is a horizontal one, okay, and that way he can. The korah is horizontal, lechi is vertical, right? So he can do either a lechi on either side, or a korah going across, and that's enough to allow him to carry in the space between the two batim. Okay, Amrullah, they said to him, "In me'arvin reshut harabim b'kach." We don't allow you to transform a reshut harabim into your private property just with a minimal repair, like putting a lechi or putting a korah. But the point is that what does Rabbi Yehuda say? Rabbi Yehuda says that even if you have something that's basically mifulash, that you have only two walls there because you have the two houses facing each other, if you have two lechayin, that's enough, right? One on either side. So that's what we're following here. So when we said Eino Mifulash, that it's not open, we mean that it has two lechayim. And according to Ben Betera, even if it had only one on one side, it would be that would be acceptable for bringing a Sefer Torah into that area.
Hillel accepts only one.
Yeah, but you need three walls according to Hillel. You need 3 walls according to
What I
Beit
can
Hillel.
understand is that
Here we're talking about only 2 walls and a lechi. Beit Hillel is saying 3 walls and either a lechi or a korah at the end, but you need 3 walls. You can't have only 2.
What I understand is how you can have a mavoy with 2 walls only.
It's open on both ends. It's just a passageway. It's like an alley.
Yeah, but
It's like an alley.
But what difference is that from 2 different? Is it like the distance? Is it the distance that makes it an alleyway, or is it?
It's not that this
Like
No, because it's only for people coming out of their chatzir into this place, and then they come out.
That's what makes it a mavoy.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So Amar le Abaye ledidach nami le Rabbanan atil ochelinu mashkin. But according to you, according to the rabbis should permit you to bring ochelinu mashkin into this place as well. They should allow you to do anything. Rashi says because kevan damrat tarvayu Rabbi Yehuda le Rabbanan damre l'sheino mefulash u'mefarshe l'sheino chaser kelum. In other words, according to you, they're both following Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that even if you have only 2 walls, all you need is 2 lechayin. So according to you, the rabbis should allow you to bring anything into this area, not just a Sefer Torah. So what chidush are they bringing here? Ella, rather we say as we turn to Amud Bet, Amar Ravashi, Ravashi says, Shalosh machitzot b'lechi yechad zeh mavoy she'eno mefulash, v'gimel machitzot b'lo lechi zeh mavoy mefulash. Va'afilu Rabbi Eliezer da'amar ba'inan lechayim, ha'nimi le'ochelinu mashkin, aval le'sefer Torah b'chad lechi sagi. What it says is like this, that what is our definition in the Mishnah of mifulash or not mifulash, open or not open? Let's go back to the original premise. We're talking about 3 walls. In other words, a mavoy that is a dead end mavoy. One end is closed, one end is sealed. So you have 3 walls, and on the end you have a lechi. That's considered not mifulash. In other words, that's considered totally closed. If you don't have a lechi at all, okay, mavoy she'eno mifulash, that means that you have 1 lechi, and if you don't have any lechi, you don't have any marking at the end, then that's considered an open one. That's mifulash, right? So according to this, what is Ben Betera saying? Ben Betera is saying you can bring it into this place, even though it's only 3 walls and there's no marking at the end at all. You're allowed to bring the Sefer Torah in there, because we're bending the rules in order to allow you to save a Sefer Torah. And when it comes to 1 lechi on the end, that's what we call a mavoy she'eno mifulash, a mavoy that is not open, right? And there, even the rabbis agree you can bring it in. But they're both following Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda requires 2 lechayin, 1 on either side, not just 1. Remember, because we learned that before. Rabbi Eliezer said you need 2. So and the chidush is that even Rabbi Eliezer, who requires 2 for a Sefer Torah, will let you carry with just 1. In other words, so the rabbis are saying, how far do we bend the rule of Rabbi Eliezer? Normally, to carry things into this mavoy, according to Rabbi Eliezer, you would need a lechi on both sides. You have 3 walls and a lechi on both sides of the opening, a vertical pole on both sides of the opening to remind you. But according to But in this case, the Chachamim say, we'll reduce it by 1. To save a Sefer Torah, even if there's only 1 lechi, you can carry it in. Ben Betera says, you know what? Even if there's no lechi, you can bring it in. Because we're going to bend the rule, we're going to go all the way down to the Deoraita, and Deoraita it's permitted. So we're going to allow you to bend the rules even further and do something that's permitted, as long as it's permitted mideoraita, we're going to allow you to do it to save a Sefer Torah. That's how we understand the Mishnah. So now the new Mishnah says, Matilin mazon gimel seudot, haroi ladam ladam, haroi lebehema lebehema. You can save food for 3 meals if there's a fire on Shabbat, God forbid. 3 meals. Whatever you need for a person to eat their 3 meals, and whatever you need for an animal to eat its 3 meals. Ketzad hauso naflat lekabelei Shabbat matilin mazon gimel seudot, b'shacharit matilin mazon bet seudot, b'mincha mazon seudah achat. If the fire would happen on Friday night, you can save 3 meals. If the fire happens on Shabbat morning, so you already ate Friday night dinner, you only need 2 meals. If it happens on Shabbat afternoon, you only need Sudah Shadishit. Okay, so that you only take what you need for that Shabbat. Rabbi Yossi says, Le'olam matilin mazon shalosh seudot. The rabbis didn't make it dependent on that particular Shabbat. They gave a license, you can save mazon for shalosh seudot, for 3 seudot. It doesn't matter whether it happened on Friday night, Shabbat day, Shabbat afternoon. It's irrelevant according to Rabbi Yossi. When the rabbis Rabbi Yossi says, the rabbis fixed it as an objective rule. You can save the amount for 3 meals. It doesn't matter when it happens. The Chachamim say, no, it's dependent on that particular Shabbat and what you actually need. So the Gemara says, Bichti, let's take a look. Behetera katarach. This person is carrying things that are not muktzeh, correct? He's carrying things that are food. So what's the problem? So Natil Tefeh, why doesn't he save everything in the kitchen? Why is he only saving 3 meals? Amar Rava says, the problem is that since a person gets really panicked about saving their possessions, okay, once you allow him to save something, he's going to go nuts. He's going to extinguish the fire. He's going to do other melachot that are violations of the Torah because he wants to save everything. So therefore we set a limit. We say, you know what, this is all you can save, and that's it. And once he makes peace with the fact that he can't save anything, he's going to say, what can I do? Amar le Abai says, but what about the halacha that we learned? If somebody's barrel of wine was on their roof and it broke and it starts leaking, you can bring another vessel and put it under that vessel. But what you can't do is, you can't go beyond that. So you can take one kli, you can take one vessel and put it under the barrel that's leaking to catch whatever's leaking. But you can't hold another vessel on the side to catch what is coming out into the air. And you can't take another vessel and put it next to the roof that what's dripping off of the roof that already leaked will go into this vessel. In other words, you're permitted one vessel, that's it. No more than that. But the question is, but over there's no issue of fire. Hatam mai gezerah. What's the gezerah? We understand here, if we let you save everything, you're going to put out the fire. But over here, if we let you take 3 vessels to save the wine that's leaking instead of just one, what's the gezerah? Answer, hachinami. Here too. So he says, hachanami, so too here. Gezerah shema yavi keli derech reshut harabim. Because what happens if you don't have enough kelim, you don't have enough vessels to salvage all the wine? What are you going to do? Run to your neighbor's house, run to somebody else's house, bring vessels through the reshut harabim, through the public domain. You're going to carry them in order to save your wine. So that's why we give you a limit. We say 1 vessel only. Everybody has 1 vessel in their house. More than that, don't even forget it. It's gone. Gufa will go back to that halacha. So if the person, his wine is leaking, he can bring 1 vessel and put it under the barrel that's leaking. He can't bring another vessel to catch what's spilling into the air. He can't bring another vessel and catch what's spilling. In other words, if some of it's spritzing out into the air or whatever, he can't catch that. He can't catch whatever's spilling off of the roof. Nizdamin lo orachin. But what if guests come over and they want to drink the wine? So then maybe okay, then what he can do is he could say, well, I have guests, I need it. I need it for right now. So since I need it for right now, I'm allowed to catch it. He can't catch all the wine and then invite guests over. But if he sees that his wine is leaking, what will he do? Invite everybody over so he needs the wine, and then he's allowed to take as many vessels as he needs to catch the wine. But you're not allowed to play games here. You can't do a trick. You can't invite everybody over, pretend that you needed to invite everybody over just so you can save your wine, and then say, oh, look at that, my wine's leaking. In other words, you have to really invite the people. You invited the people, right, and they came. But you can't pretend that you really need the guests, invite them to get the wine, and then say, oh, sorry guys, go home. I just wanted you to come over so I could save the wine. It was just a trick. You can't do that. It has to be for real. Mishum Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda Amru Ma'arivim. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda said, actually, you know what? You can even play a trick. You can play a trick. You can invite them over. Even though you know they're not going to drink all this wine, save all the wine, pretending like you really need it for them.
What does mean
Subterfuge means playing a game, playing a trick. In other words, you invite the people over. You say, oh, I really need this wine for the guests, but you don't really need it. You know they're going to leave it over, right? So you invited all these guests. You invited guests. And you say, oh, I need the whole barrel. So you save all of it, and then you only needed a little bit of for kiddush. You didn't really need for everybody that much. And so you played a trick in order to justify saving it. But Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, since this is only a rabbinical prohibition, you're allowed to do a subterfuge. You're allowed to do this winking one eye, pretending, that you really need the wine. Maybe this argument about saving wine and whether you're allowed to falsely use a false pretext to save the wine of guests, maybe this is really a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Because we learned in a Braita, if you had 2 animals that fell into a pit on Yom Tov, so it's Otoviat Beno, it's the father animal or the mother animal and the son. So you can't slaughter them on the same day. So the problem is Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ma'aleh Tarishon Al Menat L'Shochoto V'Asheni Oseh Lo Parnasa B'Mkomo. He says B'Shvil Shelo Yamud. Listen, you can't take them both out of the pit on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, because you're only allowed to handle it if you're going to use it on Yom Tov. Correct? So what do? You know you can't slaughter both of them on Yom Tov because you can't slaughter on the same day the mother and the baby. So what do? You can only take out one, and you take care of the other one down there. You give it in the pit, food, whatever it needs till after Yom Tov. Rabbi Yoshua says, Malinet Harishon Almenat L'Shochato Ve'eno Shochato U'Ma'arim U'Malet Hasheni Ratzah Ze Shochet. Rabbi Yoshua says, I'll tell you a trick. Take up the first one as if you're going to slaughter it on Yom Tov. Say, I want this one to slaughter on Yom Tov. Bring it up. Then say, you know what? I changed my mind. I want the other one. Then bring the other one. Then say, you know what? I want the first one. Then you can do whatever you want. All we know is you can't slaughter both of them. So the problem is once you bring up one, you can't say I'm going to slaughter both of them. Because it's otov yed beno. Okay? So isn't this the same issue? In other words, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, you're allowed to play a trick to subvert, to get around the issue of muktzeh here. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the first opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, you're not allowed to play a trick. So too with regard to the machloket about saving the wine. According to the first opinion, the Tanakama, you're not allowed to pretend that you need the wine for the guest and then you don't really need it. And according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, you are allowed to. So it's the same thing, right? So mimai, we can't say that it's definitely the same thing because because maybe even though Rabbi Eliezer doesn't allow you to take the second animal out of the pit, maybe that's because you can feed the animal in the pit. So no problem. But when it comes to wine, if you don't save it, you're going to lose it. So maybe even he would agree that you can do subterfuge. You can pretend you need it for the guests when you don't. And maybe the fact that Rabbi Yoshua allows you to play a trick and to take both animals out of the pit even though you really don't need them, maybe the only reason he allows you to do that is because of tzar balei chayim, because it's causing suffering to the animals. But maybe the wine is not suffering. Maybe he wouldn't allow you to play a trick. Maybe he would say you can only save the wine when you need it fair and square. So we can't say that they're the same case. If you already saved good, fine bread from your house on Shabbat, you can't now save inferior bread. But if you saved bad bread, coarse bread, then you can go back and save good bread. And if the fire, God forbid, happened on Yom Kippur, you can save, and Motzei Yom Kippur is Shabbat, which remember, we don't have that anymore today. We don't have such a thing as Yom Kippur falling after Shabbat or Shabbat falling after Yom Kippur. But if it did, you could save food on Yom Kippur for Shabbat. Aval lo mi Shabbat li Yom Kippurim. But if Shabbat is Erev Yom Kippur, you can't save for Yom Kippur. So of course the question is, you don't need food on Yom Kippur. Right? And you're going to be eating the food on Shabbat because Saturday night is Yom Kippur, right? So, and you can save food for Shabbat. So what does it mean? It means for Motzei Yom Kippur. In other words, you can't save food on Shabbat that you're going to eat for after the fast of Yom Kippur, which is on Sunday. Okay? So even though since you're going straight from Shabbat into Yom Kippur, you might think, well, I can save food for today to prepare for the fast. Maybe I can also save food for after the fast. So it says you can't do that. Or Tosafot says maybe you want to save food on Shabbat to feed to children and ill people on Yom Kippur. Right? So and certainly if Yom Tov is on Saturday night, you can't save food on Shabbat for Yom Tov because that's like preparing from Shabbat to Yom Tov. And you certainly can't save food on Shabbat for next Shabbat. That goes without saying. If you left bread in the tanur, in the oven, and then it became Shabbat. Similarly, remember, you're not allowed to do what's called ridiyat tapat. You can't remove bread from the oven on Shabbat. You're not allowed to. It was asur midrabanan. It's rabbinically prohibited to do so because it was a special art to remove the bread from the side of the oven. But you can remove what you need for the 3 meals only. And you can go to your neighbors and say, "Hey, I've got 10 loaves in the oven. Everybody, come save some." It was cooked before, obviously, right? Don't use the regular tool of removing bread. Rather, you should use a knife. So it's clear that you're not doing it in the normal way, and you're doing it with what we call a shinoi. Is this really true? So didn't we learn that the yeshiva of Rabbi Ishmael said that lo ta'aseh kol melacha, you're not allowed to do melacha on Shabbat, which excludes blowing the shofar and removing bread from the oven, which is chokhmah ve'ena melacha. It's not considered melacha to blow a shofar. It's rabbinically prohibited. It's not considered melacha to remove bread from the tanur, from the oven. It's rabbinically prohibited. Okay, because it's an art, a special art to remove it. So why do we require you to do it with a knife? Why do you have to do it in an unusual way? It's not a melacha anyway. Answer, to the extent that we can change, that we can limit our violation, we do so. So in this case, it's another example where just like with the fire, you can say, you can save mazon shalosh seudot. In this case, you can recruit other people to save so the bread doesn't go to waste. And we will pick up here tomorrow.